What? More high-pressure steam locomotives? And, yeah, I decided, I know we just talked about them. I know I already went over the main principle and the whole thing, and we talked about the Fury. But there are a bunch of others, and I'm like, no, I can't just not discuss these, though I have talked about a handful in the past on other videos. So, I figured, what the heck, let's go through a short list of high-pressure steam locomotives that have been constructed before that I am familiar with. And that's what we're gonna do. Alright? Alright, we all ready for this? Are we all excited? We sitting down? Taking notes? No? No? Okay, well maybe you should. Anyway, the first one we're gonna get out of the way, though, is the other one that was mentioned specifically last time. When I was talking about the Fury, I mentioned that the London and Northeastern were also working on their own high-pressure locomotive, the 10,000. Sometimes called the Hush Hush because it was a top-secret project. But she wasn't nearly as wild as the Fury was. Mostly because she only operated at 450 psi. That is above the high-pressure threshold of 350, but not nearly as extreme as Fury's. She was also designed by the legendary Sir Nigel Gresley, and much like other high-pressure designs, the idea was to make her more fuel-efficient. She possessed a single steam circuit that utilized a Yarrow water tube boiler, which was based on a naval design. She was also compound. She used 2 inside high-pressure cylinders and 2 outside low-pressure cylinders that utilized Welshart's ever-reliable valve gear. The design work first started back in 1924, but she wouldn't be finished till 1929, and started her trials, which lasted throughout much of the 30s, but she was never particularly good. Mostly because, frankly, she was just a pain in the butt. For one thing, even though she was meant to operate at 450, they couldn't actually get her pressure that high, only reaching 305, which isn't even high pressure. That's just kind of normal. Her triangular boiler also gave her a bizarre appearance, very bulgy. That kind of reminds me of a beluga whale. And in the end, the Class W1, as she was known, was just unsatisfactory. She wasn't doing what she was supposed to do. That Yarrow boiler seemed to be the major issue, as it just wasn't designed for railroad operations. The operation never reached the standards of an equivalent fire tube boiler, and in the end, she, wasn't scrapped. Instead, she was rebuilt, much like the Fury. In 1936, she was taken over to Doncaster Works and given a conventional boiler and 3 triple expansion cylinders. This new boiler was a modified boiler used for the A4 locomotives, resulting in her sort of being part of that family, but she was not considered an outright sister of theirs, because she still retained a lot of the differences that had made her special in her original form. And her valves were actually undersized when compared to the other A4s, but that also gave her decent hauling capability. And she didn't share their wheel arrangement. Hush was a 464, not a 462, meaning she kept her larger cab, which crews really liked on her, and she ran very well in that new form. She was never officially given a name at any point, but unofficially, everyone always called her Hush Hush, or Galloping Sausage, when she was in her original form. Though in her new form, Hush Hush kind of stuck, and it's kind of a cute name, so fair enough. She sadly didn't survive dieselization, though, as she would be withdrawn on June 1st, 1959, and broken up for scrap, also at Doncaster, where she'd been rebuilt in the first place. In fact, that's who built her originally. Everything involving her pretty much happened at Doncaster. She was born, she lived, she was modified, and died at Doncaster. The only real remnant of her now is one of her tenders, number 5484, which now is carried by one of her adoptive A4 siblings, number 4488, Union of South Africa. So, hey, that's something, I guess. But enough talk about the United Kingdom. Let's move back home here, to America, where we push the envelope, where we make big chungus. Surely our high-pressure outings are pretty crazy, right? And No. Actually, it's quite surprising. Compared to a lot of the other experiments with different countries, we were fairly conservative with high-pressure locomotives here. One of the earliest attempts was by Baldwin, number 60,000, which was designed as just kind of their penultimate creation, adding a whole bunch of modern features to serve as a demonstrator for all these new technologies. And while a lot of the new technologies in her would be used by other locomotives, the high-pressure element and her design in general was not. They received no orders for her. Despite being an impressive beast and capable of quite a lot, in the end there were simply no buyers. She also only barely counts as a high-pressure locomotive because... Okay, I mentioned everything above 350 psi is considered a high-pressure locomotive, right? She operated at 350. So... Okay, yes, but also... barely. Just barely. Literally on the fringe. But she did have a water tube boiler, so, hey, we'll give her a pass. And part of my reason for doing this is the fact that I believe she is the only high-pressure steam locomotive in the world that still lives. She's still on display at the Franklin Institute Science Museum in Philadelphia. And as far as I know, there are no other examples of a high-pressure steam locomotive ever in history that survived into preservation. But Baldwin really loved their little creation, so they made sure she was saved. She's been there since 1933, so she was preserved even before dieselization came around. But she wasn't the only attempt here in America. There were others, and there was also the New York Central HS-1A, number 800. 800 was constructed by Alco in 1931, and in a similar manner to the Fury, she used the Schmidt system. The one where they start out with an ultra-high pressure circuit, and then goes to a high pressure circuit, then a low pressure circuit. It's all fun and crazy and ridiculous. Though she wasn't quite as nuts as the Fury, because at most she operated at 850 psi. Still pretty high, but not as high as, she could have been. And ultimately, she was a complete failure. There's very little information on her because she was really awful. She performed very poorly, and New York Central found that her only use was as a hump shunter, which is insane because she's a tender engine. Like the only use you could find for her is shunting. That's not a good sign. She'd be scrapped in 1939. There was also the Horatio Allen. Yes, an American locomotive with a name. Unusual already. She was numbered 1400, a 280, but named Horatio Allen, so we'll just call her Allie. Allie was built in 1924 by the Delaware and Hudson Railroad. She was, at that time, the largest 280 in the world. She used a water tube boiler, which is pretty normal for high-pressure locomotives, but only operated at the 350 psi that I mentioned before. Granted, it was 1924, so that was pretty high by those standards, but still only barely counting as a high-pressure locomotive. But with the water tube, I mean, yeah, we let the 60,000 get here, so we'll let her in too. She looked pretty bizarre because she looks bulgy and crazy and ridiculous. Like, what is all of this? Well, the large pipe that's draped over her smoke box is actually the exhaust from the high-pressure cylinders, going to the low-pressure cylinders on the other side. It was a bizarre arrangement, but in terms of fuel efficiency, she was apparently very good. It was just the maintenance. Much like the Fury, she worked, yes, and they saved money on fuel, but not on fixing her and keeping her working. So, yeah, that didn't go well. It's also completely unknown when she would have been scrapped. Another one by Delaware and Hudson was built in 1927 named John B. Jervis, number 1401. Jervis was pretty similar to Allie, but she operated at 400 psi, and her cylinders were smaller. Her overall appearance was also meant to be more streamlined. She still was bulgy, but not like chaotic madness. She still had that pipe over the smoke box, though. There's not a lot of information on her, but given she was also a failure and a very similar design to Allie, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they had the exact same problem. They probably saved money on fuel with Jarvis, but didn't in terms of keeping her running. So, that wasn't really great. And then there was the James Archibald. Yet another 280 built by the Delaware and Hudson, and this one is in 1930. She was yet again a 2-cylinder compound, but they were like, okay guys, I know we're having problems with the maintenance here, so we're going to make this one operate at even a higher pressure. How that corrects the maintenance issue, I don't know, but she operated at 500 psi and was given larger driving wheels. She had the exact same problem as her other half-kooky sisters, whatever. This whole family's ridiculous. They were just too maintenance-intensive. Yes, they did save money on fuel, but at what cost? Paying the maintenance guys to work harder to actually keep them running in the first place, which completely outweighed the savings on coal. So there was no point. And if you think those three were the only time Delaware and Hudson tried this, you'd be wrong. They tried it again with a 480. Ah, yes, adding an extra leading wheel will surely fix this problem. And she was named LF Lori. So just Lori, got it. She was a triple expansion engine with a water tube boiler and operated at 500 psi. The way she worked was that the steam fed the high-pressure cylinder under the right side of the cab. Then an intermediate pressure cylinder was fed under the left side of the cab, and then the two low-pressure cylinders were at the front. Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot, and this is ridiculous. And in Lori's case, she didn't even work well. The other three at least functioned. They were too expensive to operate, but they did function. Lori didn't. She was in the shops a lot, suffering frequent breakdowns. One D&H employee is recorded as saying that every time we sent her out, a machine shop had to go with her. So yeah, that wasn't good. And believe it or not, that's pretty much it for regular high-pressure steam locomotives. When I say regular, I mean there's at least one more that I'm aware of, but they... Okay. So you might be familiar with the General Electric steam turbine locomotives, the ones that don't look like steam engines but are, but they're steam turbines. And as turbines, they get weird. Turbines are weird. Turbines are always weird when it comes to locomotives because they also, on their own, never work half the time, except like one time in Sweden. But these General Electric models are a bit unique because they also count in the high pressure department. Now, turbine locomotives aren't always also included in the high pressure department, but sometimes they are, and in this case, these would be. I sort of struggle to include them with the others because they're turbines, and like I said, turbines get weird on their own, but I'm going to throw them in there because this is the only time I'm aware of when it comes to American locomotives where we broke the 1,000 psi threshold because the General Electric steam turbines operated at 1,500 psi. Oh, okay. That was a lot, but to be fair, nothing terrible ever happened with them. But they were also a failure because they were turbines and they were expensive to operate and manage in general. They weren't efficient. And them being high pressure certainly didn't help. So yeah, that wasn't good. But that was a thing that happened. And now we can leave America and travel north to Canada and their single attempt at a high pressure steam locomotive, because they totally did that. The Canadian Pacific Railroad 210-4 compound locomotive, constructed in 1931. She was numbered 8000. And it was a 3-cylinder compound high-pressure experimental locomotive that used the Schmidt system just like the Fury. She operated at 1,350 psi, which then dropped to 850 psi for the regular high-pressure section, and then 250 psi for the low-pressure section because of the Schmidt system and everything's got to be weird here. She was constructed by the Angus shops in 1931 and was the heaviest steam locomotive Canadian Pacific had at the time. Unfortunately, she'd be scrapped by 1940 because she was high pressure and it was a Schmidt system, and it was too expensive to work on her. There's no evidence she was a poor steamer. She probably ran, but the savings they had on fuel didn't equate to savings in the maintenance shed. So yeah, it's same verse, same as the first. Now we can move on to Switzerland. Hello! What are you guys doing here? Well, Switzerland had at least one attempt at a high-pressure steam locomotive, and she's weird. Because for one thing, she's a tank engine? What? You guys made a high-pressure tank engine? Why would you... Okay. So, yes, granted, she was pretty unique, and did some cool things, but also didn't work, because of course she didn't. She also looked weird as heck, doubtless you've noticed. If you're wondering what those two things on the front that look like traffic lights are, those aren't headlights. Those are cowls to protect the firebox air intakes. Probably from things like snow, because Switzerland, which is fair. She was a 262 built at Winterthur by the Swiss Locomotive and Machine Company at the end of 1927 to the design of Mr. Buckley, who was their chief engineer. So this was his pet project. He was going to create the ultimate steam locomotive of precision Swiss engineering, and that didn't go so well, but he did his best. She worked at 850 psi. A tank engine. Worked at 850 psi. Switzerland, what the heck is that? And her system was supplied by a compound feed pump, which had its own tiny little superheater in the firebox. The feed water for this engine was preheated to 180 degrees Fahrenheit by the exhaust steam of the main cylinders and the feed pump. Then it was heated up again to 450 degrees Fahrenheit by the feed heater at the front of the boiler. The air to the grates was also preheated by a heat exchanger at the front of the smoke box, and the water tube boiler, because of course it used a water tube boiler, had a top drum and two bottom drums connected by the water tube walls. It was really, really weird. But this design was meant to deal with the scale issue I mentioned last time. Remember how I said scale tends to build up in these engines, especially, water tube boilers, and that can cause them to explode? And there were plenty of solutions for it, and this was one of them, or at least one that was attempted, because due to the way this engine functioned, most of the scale would be deposited in the feed water heater. That was very much on purpose, because the feed water heater was relatively easy to access, and you could clean it out regularly, so it wasn't really that big of a deal. Great. However, as I just said, and you may have caught this, I said most of the scale. Not all of it. Some of it got past that, and formed in the boiler tubes, which is absolutely where you do not want it to build up ever. There are no details regarding whatever happened to this engine, but I can assure you she was almost certainly scrapped at some point, likely when they realized that their solution to the scale just wasn't a solution. It didn't work, at least not as much as it should have. Not enough to make this safe. Sticking with Europe, which is where we're going to stay for the rest of this video to be clear, we're going over to Germany. Of course, Germany would work on high-pressure steam locomotives. And yes, they had several. The earliest one that I know of was the H-17, built in 1925 by Henschel. She used the Schmidt high-pressure system, again just like the Fury, and was a 460 with a boiler pressure of 1,000 psi. You're starting off with the big guns right off the bat, Germany. I don't know what I expected. And she was a complete failure. She did not work very well. So the design was not repeated at all. But that didn't stop them. They said, okay, obviously the problem is we didn't make her crazy enough. Which I can't confirm. That's what they said. But that's the only explanation for the HO2. What the heck is that, Germany? That is something. Okay, the HO2 is one of the more unique high-pressure steam locomotives on this list, because she doesn't work like any of the others. And in fact, she doesn't work like most of their steam locomotives in general. Her steam was delivered at 1,750 psi. Because Germany. And she was delivered in 1930, built to the design of a Dr. L. Loeffler. Her system was remarkably complex. Doubtless you'd noticed. She did not use the Schmidt system. Instead, she used the Steam itself can't deposit scale. Water does, but not steam. So if you use just the steam to transfer the heat and not any of the water, then you avoid the scale. So okay, alright, fair enough. Saturated steam from a steam generator was pumped through the high-pressure superheater tubes which lined the firebox. Once it got there, it was superheated to 900 degrees Fahrenheit, with the pressure being raised to 1700 psi. Only a quarter of that went to the high-pressure cylinders, though. The rest was sent back to the steam generator to evaporate more water and then continue the cycle. The high-pressure cylinder exhaust passed through the oil separator, one of the feed water heaters, and then the tubes of the low-pressure cylinder. The steam of the low-pressure cylinder went to 225 psi, and the high-pressure exhaust condensed in the low-pressure boiler heating tubes was pumped back to the steam generator again. That sounds very complicated, because it is. Also, this particular design ethos, while it did avoid scale, that's true, it worked for that. It had one itsy-bitsy, teensy-weeny little problem. And if you were paying attention, you may have already noticed it. I mentioned a steam generator. Don't you mean the firebox? No, you fool. It would be ridiculous. See, the HO2 couldn't raise steam by herself. At all. She needed pre-made steam to function because of the way she worked. So you would have to get steam from a steam generator, which you didn't carry on board because that would have just involved using a firebox like normal. No. We can't do that. Or from another locomotive, because the firebox tubes that she used were cooled by steam, not water. There's no water allowed here, only steam. But you can't get the steam without the water, but you don't want to put water in the engine because that'll involve scale, so you gotta make the steam elsewhere. But by making the steam elsewhere, you have made this entire engine completely worthless in most contexts. Also, she needed her steam pump to constantly function. If it failed at any point, she failed. They did give her 2, they thought about that, but she was notoriously unreliable because she's ridiculous. And she was scrapped at some point. It's not known when. And last for Germany was the H-45. This was a late addition to the high-pressure department, and also called Prototype T-22-571. So we're just going to call it the H-45 then, got it. She was a 210-2, built in 1951. She was built for the German State Railroad and had a Lamont boiler, a type of boiler that was a water tube design but had pumped circulation. And she ran at a pressure at 750 pounds per square inch. Interestingly, she was fired by pulverized brown coal and was intended for heavy freight trains. Also, she sucked. They gave her a condenser as part of her operation, and that basically never worked at all. She was abandoned almost immediately, and was mostly scrapped in 1961, but parts of her did survive. Her outside cylinders, trailing wheels, and the rear part of her frame were used in the construction of 18201. And 18201 is still very much around, so hey, that's something. She's not high pressure though. She's relatively normal. This wasn't. This was ridiculous, and it didn't work. Actually, it's a running theme on this list. None of the high-pressure locomotives worked. Also, last time I had a few comments from people saying, well, what about, ships, and, like, static steam boilers for industrial purpose? And yes, those can go higher. We're not talking about those. We're talking about locomotives. Okay? Just want to be clear about that. And now, the final place on our list of high-pressure nonsense. We must go to France. Oh boy, what is that thing? I don't know why I thought it was going to be anything normal. This thing was called the PL-241B. Thank you for that. Built for the PLM, or the Paris-Lyons and Mediterranean Railway, which used the Schmidt system. Great. There isn't much information about her, but she was scrapped by 1936. Also, probably should mention, she ran at about, 1,565 PSI, so okay, great, France. Don't know why you did that, but you did. There's also the 232P1, which was very, well, in addition to being high pressure, she also used steam motor technology. Something else that usually didn't work too well when it came to locomotives. Okay, alright. As a result, she didn't use coupling rods. Each of the motors would drive a single axle. The problem with this, though, is there was concern about wheel slip, so the motors would be coupled together by a hydraulic servo system, which would allow control over the inlet valve cams and make sure the motors functioned synchronously, and that would, in theory, reduce the issue with the whole possible wheel slip problem. She was built by SACM Gravenstaden, and her design had a dual pressure boiler. Water from the tender passed through an ACFI feed water heater and was raised to 215 degrees Fahrenheit. The forward low pressure section worked at 280 pounds per square inch, which was already fairly high actually, especially back then, but still doesn't count as high pressure. And it sent its hot water via two Nor pumps to the high pressure boiler. So if you notice, wait a minute, it's going to the low pressure first, and yes, and that was the idea. The plan here was they couldn't figure out how to stop scale buildup, but this system would, in theory, make it so that the scale was deposited in the low pressure section, not the high pressure section, which was still bad, but way less dangerous. The high pressure section, mind you, worked at 840 pounds per square inch, and the high pressure feed pumps were of a special tandem compound design in order to handle all the nonsense going on here, and each of her driving axles was powered by two high-speed, 3-cylinder, double-acting Uniflow steam engines. Each one of these also had a gearbox that gave provision for vertical movement. There's a lot going on here. I can't even keep track. I'm sure I'm missing something, but it was insane. But she was given extensive trials in the end, even given fancy streamlined shrouding, which doesn't even look that fancy, but she was given it. And apparently, in her case, the steam motors actually worked really well, but the boiler system kind of stank. It was decided not to repair her in 1948, and she was rebuilt in 1949, but there's no information regarding what she was rebuilt into. So yeah, that's kind of a mystery. But yeah, she was crazy. So yeah, that was France. That's great. That's wonderful. Everything's fantastic. And yes, the high pressure idea just never really worked in any time it was attempted. In fact, literally every time it was attempted, it didn't work. Because in order to make it manageable to utilize an engine, a locomotive, operating at such a high pressure, you need a bunch of equipment to, make it not explode. And generally, the extra equipment and the extra industrial practices, the extra mechanical practices, all of that is more expensive than the fuel you save. So, in the end, there was very rarely a point of it. Now, it is notable to say that over time, as steam technology developed, the operating pressure of locomotives in general did steadily start to rise. So, assuming that we didn't switch over to diesel and still utilize steam on the main railways today, in regular operations, would the pressure have kept going up as newer design ethoses came in, new ideas? And yeah, I'd say probably. It probably wouldn't be over 1,000, but it would be higher than it was. But yeah, that was a lot. And somehow, America weren't the crazy ones in this conversation. Most of our attempts were very tame. France and Germany, on the other hand, ugh. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.